So, I debate with myself all the time as to whether or not science fiction and fantasy are the same thing, because they sort of seem like they are, and I understand the elements that make them not the same thing, but today I'm in a very much they are the same thing sort of mood. And one day I'm gonna look back on this video, be like, no, shut up TC, you're wrong, it's stupid, science fiction and fantasy are not the same thing. But they are, though. And I know that fans of both are probably going to bring their torches and pitchforks about this, but no, science fiction and fantasy are practically indistinguishable. I'm gonna compare Children of Blood and Bone and Dune. And it's probably gonna be like, why would an African folklore fantasy novel that is based upon commentary on police violence, similar to a planetary sci-fi exposition dump that was written in the 1960s? The thing is, they're very different books. The prose of Dune is not simple, and Children of Blood and Bone is a young adult. And I guess when it comes down to the prose itself, maybe it's just because I'm illiterate, but like, they had so many complicated names and complicated places, and they just kind of dumped them all on me at once in the beginning. And I would prefer to like get directly into the plot. I prefer narratives that involve more about character growth and development, and I just really struggle to get into it. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate the lack of hand-holding in complex narratives like Dune, but it was all quite unusual. Anyway, enough about Dune. A common sci-fi trope is to add a character, it's an archetype called the idiot. We see it in Philip J. Fry in Futurama, we see it in Detective Spooner in iRobot, we see it in pretty much every science fiction. You have a guy who's not familiar with the technology because he time traveled or because he's just dumb, and the characters around him explain the world in little pieces as it goes along. Dune didn't really have that, and frankly, neither did Children of Blood and Bone. And you could say like, oh, because it's fantasy, fantasy doesn't have the idiot. Fantasy absolutely has the idiot, because in fantasy, you have the muggle. It's usually the guy who either doesn't have magic or just recently came upon his magic, and all the other characters have to explain to him what the hell is going on in the world. Doesn't that sound familiar? Not necessarily a non-magic person, it comes from pretty much everywhere. And it's a person who just doesn't know the rules of the world. And it's the same thing. We see it Aang from Avatar, because he's been gone for the past 100 years. Everybody has to catch him up as to what's going on. You see Frodo from Lord of the Rings, because he's in this sheltered Shire environment, and the rest of the world kind of happens as he builds understanding alongside the audience. And I think this is one of the biggest tropes that makes the sci-fi fantasy genre, is that you have this big complex world that's full of monsters and magic, or aliens and unknown technology, and somebody has to have it explained to them. And you'd think that a story about a young girl who has to get in contact with a being that's higher in the Kardashev scale in order to return this powerful weapon back to her people on her planet, you would think that that would be a sci-fi, but it's not. And you would think that the story about a guy who actually finds out that he's of noble birth and goes all the way to a different world to fight monsters and gain acquisition of magical spices would be a fantasy, but it's not. And that's the thing, is the distinction comes not from the themes, it comes from the subject matter. And I honestly can't think of any other genre that does that. Let's take two other genres, for example. Let's say mystery and romance. In a mystery, the goal is to get to the bottom of some sort of unknown problem. Whereas in a romance, the plot usually revolves around an amorous relationship and the struggles that they go through with being in love. You can have a mystery without a romance, and you can have a romance without a mystery. But let's take a look at science fiction versus fantasy. Science fiction is about a world that's been built that takes place in a setting that has very high technology, or aliens, or monsters. And then you can even get into soft science fiction like Star Wars, where there literally is magic. You can also get into fantasy. The definition of fantasy is also a world that's been built. It's also people going on adventures that involve elements that are not in our world, such as monsters and magic. And you look at a fantasy like Avatar, where the bending is based on genetics, and that they do live in a world that advances in technology similar to our own. And you realize that these can't exist separately of one another. You can have a mystery without romance in it, and you can have a romance without mystery in it, but you cannot have a science fiction without fantasy elements in it. I guess you can have a fantasy without science fiction in it, but wouldn't that just make science fiction a type of fantasy? For example, I'm technically writing a sci-fi right now. The main character is a doctor who works with scientific elements, but if my main character was a circus clown in the same world, this would be a fantasy story instead of a science fiction story. Whereas if you have a romance and one guy is a doctor and his love interest is a lawyer, that doesn't change the fact that it's romance. If one guy is an alien from outer space and the girl is a human, that doesn't change the fact that it's romance. If they're both circus clowns, it's still romance. Whereas if you change the abilities and the settings of the characters, you can change the entire genre of what you're writing. That doesn't make any sense. So there's no practical difference between sci-fi and fantasy. That's why I kind of talk about both interchangeably. Thanks for joining me on my walk through Chicago. Bye.